Thank you for tuning in to Movie Geeks United. Actress, writer, producer, and director Ida Lupino was far ahead of her time. She was a top-tier actress, appearing in over 60 films opposite the likes of Humphrey Bogart, Edward G. Robinson, and Bing Crosby, and under the direction of talents like Raoul Walsh and Nicholas Ray. But her achievements behind the camera are even more astonishing. She was the only female director of studio films during the apex of her career, the second female member of the Directors Guild, the first woman to direct a film noir, the first to direct an episode of The Twilight Zone. Her list of accomplishments go on and on. While the film industry of today continues to struggle with nurturing greater diversity behind the camera, she broke the mold 7 decades ago, and even more impressively, she navigated the studio system during her day to explore taboo themes, bigamy, unwed pregnancy, and even rape among them. Therese Grisham and Julie Grossman have written a terrific book on Lupino's directorial efforts, titled Ida Lupino, Director, Her Art and Resilience in Times of Transition. The book gives Lupino her due both as a cinematic stylist and as a maker of brave and unique socially conscious films. We were thrilled to speak with Therese and Julie about Lupino's work. The first voice you'll hear belongs to Julie.
Her father was quite well known in England as a stage performer. She was sort of pushed into acting because it was what was expected of her. You know, at a certain point later in her life, she made a comment that always stayed with me, where she said, "After all, you can't act your life away," which, you know, is a sort of tossed-off remark, but I think really gets to her sense of wanting more than performing in front of the camera. And she was obviously, you know, a really fine actor. I mean, her sensitivity and her expressiveness, I think, are apparent to anyone who watches her films. Anyway, she came over to the U.S. In the 30s on a contract with Paramount because the executives had seen her in a film in England, and they saw like one scene, or they saw part of a film in which she was seemed quite sweet, and so they wanted to cast her in an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. And when she came to the studio after she had arrived with her mother to the U.S., she appeared as she was, as kind of, you know, saucy, precocious young woman. And, you know, one of the executives said she seems more like Mae West than Alice in Wonderland. And so, you know, we were really interested in, again, you know, the sort of the struggle she had to sort of define herself in ways that would allow her to express her creativity. She was incredibly versatile as an artist. She wrote music. She loved to write and said at one point that that was her favorite thing. Obviously a very talented performer, and her directing work is intriguing, as we talk about, you know, throughout the book.
Yeah, and reading about her experiences as an actress in those early days, it's amazing just how it seems like there's an element of self confidence in her, that she knew what was right for her. She wasn't afraid to turn down roles, which she often was kind of almost an above the title star, the female star of some of these movies, and so for her to have be brave enough to turn down roles, that didn't really endear her much to studios at the time, did it?
Yeah, exactly. And as we talk about in the book, it was interesting, an opportunity for her to sort of, you know, go to sets where directors like Raoul Walsh and others were directing, and it was how she learned her craft when she was on suspension. So she was always kind of, you know, looking for opportunities, and, you know, again, just really sort of versatile and incredibly energetic. So looking for projects that would excite her. And yes, absolutely. I mean, this is why we have resilience in the subtitle of our book, because we saw that, her art and her resilience worked together to make her successful and quite remarkable.
And if you were to choose in terms of her performing career, her time vault performances, what would you recommend?
So definitely for me, The Hard Way. And I'm interested in that film for a number of reasons. One is it was directed by Vincent Sherman, and she was lauded in the film. I think she won the New York Critics Award for that her performance in that film, as again a sort of tough broad who lives with her husband in this kind of down and out home without any resources, and she decides that her sister is quite talented, and she decides to do whatever it takes to make her sister successful in entertainment. And she actually, was very anxious in playing this role that it would, that people would see her as really, kind of vicious. And I actually see her as this incredibly strong, a sort of version of the femme fatale, where that figure, grows out of, desperation and energy and an insistence on forging a life that's better than what society typically allows women. And also the sister bond in the film is really interesting. So that film, I would say On Dangerous Ground, the Nicholas Ray film, where she plays blind woman. I would say.
What is the film where she where she sings that the One for My Baby number?
Roadhouse.
Okay.
Oh my God! Yes, that's amazing. We talk about that. I think at the beginning of the book, don't we?
Yes.
She, has incredible charisma in that film. And again, it's a film where she plays a femme fatale in a classic noir film, where she commands all the attention, because of her charisma and presence. And even though she doesn't have this sort of a sort of a melodic voice, she is so interesting in performing.
It's 2:45. There's no one in the place except you and me. So set 'em up, Joe. I've got a little story you ought to know. We're drinking, my friend, to the end of a brief episode. Make it one for my baby and one more for the road.
Well, I mean, her voice, she was lauded for that at the time, saying that, her voice sounds like a female Hoagie Carmichael.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think a couple of other films that your listeners should take a look at. They Drive by Night, with Aft and Humphrey Bogart, and she plays a woman who sort of goes crazy, and she's another femme fatale, but she has this incredible courtroom performance, where she sort of famously, she kills her husband, but again, in the film, because he's a sort of drunken lout, and trying to gain some kind of freedom. But in this courtroom scene, she's sort of, loses, her self-possession, and she starts screaming, "The doors made me do it, the doors made me do it."
And I saw the doors. I heard the note. I saw the doors. The doors made me do it. Yes. The doors made me do it. The doors made me do it. The doors made me do it.
Lupino's feature directorial debut came in 1949 with the release of Not Wanted, a drama about a young woman who falls for a musician who impregnates, then abandons her. The film also marked the debut of its leading lady, Sally Forrest, an actress who would also star in 2 more of Lupino's films.
Therese, her first directorial effort, I think it's her first, which she didn't actually get credit for, she kind of had to stumble into that out of necessity, the Not Wanted film.
Well, the original director, Julie, you're going to have to help me here.
Yeah.
She had a heart attack, so she stepped in, I think, on the 3rd day of...
Yeah, she took over directing, and as we talk about, it was not an easy process, as many of the films she directed were not easy because of the subject matter. So here she was making a film in 1949 about unwed motherhood. And she was battling with the censors, with the Production Code Administration throughout, as she also did, particularly in relation to The Hitch-Hiker, but also Outrage, which was a story about a woman being raped. But Not Wanted, I think, is really quite remarkable, as it establishes her directing career as someone who is interested in the stories of marginal women. And also, viewers will observe her incredible shot composition. I think of, like scenes like where Sally is sort of scaling the walls as she's walking up the streets of the city, and how visually expressive Lupino's shot composition is. But yeah, so I think notable about that film are the fact that she did sort of become the director as a matter of coincidence. Also, that she found these young performers, who were not well known, and that was one of the things that she wanted to do, was to give performers who were not famous a chance. And also, again, establishing this sort of investment, this belief in telling stories that Hollywood wouldn't normally tell, and stories about people for whom the so-called American dream was not on offer, like young Sally, who is following her desires and then has an awfully traumatic experience. And as we talk about that, Lupino really drawn to the theme of female trauma.
Do you wish to tell me the name of the father and his whereabouts? Perhaps we could communicate with him.
I don't know where he is. He went away. I haven't heard from him since.
I see. Well, tell me, my dear, have you decided whether you want to keep your baby after it's born?
I don't know.
All of her films contain elements of film noir, and all of her films are, in one way or another, social problem films, and predominantly for and about women, which was definitely not usual fare in Hollywood. And so therefore, it's really not surprising that she had to do battle with the censors. And, she wanted to make movies that they sort of emulated Italian neorealism, about the lives of real sort of regular people, mostly women who, suffer these traumas.
This was the Hays Code that she was working under, right?
Yeah.
So when she's dealing with subjects like rape and bigamy and all of these different subjects she worked on, were there fights? Were there battles with the code?
Yeah, that's not how she waged the war, though. She didn't. She wasn't. She was very diplomatic, and she knew how to butter up the censors. But she also, using techniques and methods like that, she got her own way.
Definitely. I think that's well said. And she was, as Therese is saying, she was interested in compromising so that she could make the films.
Yeah.
And so rather than, dramatizing the process, she would butter up the censors, and she would find ways to get as much of her intentions filmed as she could. For example, filming the labor scene, Sally's labor in Not Wanted, from a subjective perspective, which allowed her to navigate the censors' demands that she not focus on female on the labor scenes.
One of Lupino's strongest directorial efforts was 1950's Outrage, the story of a young woman who must deal with the unforeseen trauma that lingers in the aftermath of a rape. This emotionally acute drama featured actress Mala Powers in a powerfully raw lead performance.
They're all staring at this house. They're whispering. All day they've been looking up.
And people are sorry about what happened.
I'm going back to work tomorrow. If they want to stare, let them have a good look.
There's a great deal of sort of film noir, German expressionism in it. But at the moment of the rape, the actual rape, when she's finally caught, all we hear is the blaring of a horn, so truck horn that's blaring, and that kind of is the sound bridge to the next scene of her stumbling home at night. So that was a deft way of taking care of the rape. Clearly we also see, again, this is repeated, her subjective perspective, and not the violence act itself.
Yeah, Outrage is just a staggering movie. In the past few weeks, I've been revisiting her movies, some of which I saw before and watching for the second time. And we talked about something like Not Wanted or several of her other films. And when you watch these films, you're not only taken in by Ida's obvious gifts, but also somebody like Sally Forrest, who was featured in several of her films. And I gained a whole appreciation for her as a performer as well. I mean, it was equally as brave for an actress, someone on the other side of the camera, to take on these kind of taboo subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mala Powers in Outrage is really, that's a stunning performance. And as you say, Sally Forrest in Never Fear, the film that Lupino directed about an artist stricken with polio, and Not Wanted, which we talked about earlier. You're right, and I think that's an opportunity to make a point about one of Lupino's gifts as a director, which was her sensitivity to actors. And all the good performers who worked with her commented on what a good director she was, because she understood, because she had been a performer. She was an actor. So she understood actors, and I think that's why she was able to draw out these young performers like Sally Forrest and Mala Powers and Keith Brassell. So I agree that the performance, they're quite brave performances by these young women, who are tackling really controversial subjects.
Sally Forrest's performance in Hard, Fast, and Beautiful is amazing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and
so the moment when she really takes in that her mother is exploiting her is intense.
And these movies are so incredibly prescient. I mean, for the time they were made, I'm thinking of something like Never Fear, which is essentially a dancer stricken by polio, and she's confined to a wheelchair for much of the film. And does that seem like a particularly personal film for Ida? Didn't she experience the kind of the effects of polio herself as a youngster?
Yeah, she did. And I think, as you say, that was a very personal story for her. And of course, we need to remember that this is before the vaccine was available.
Yeah.
So it's a very topical subject, and as and deeply personal. And Lupino, I think, did some amazing things in that film, which did not have as much of an audience when it came out as her other films did. But that the wheelchair dance, that square dance, is quite remarkable. I mean, very moving.
You'll be surprised at what you'll do when you've made up your mind to live again. Hey, I've got an idea. I'm going to take you to a dance.
A dance?
Sure. I'm going to take you to our square dance Saturday night. You ever done any square dance?
Yes. And I don't think you're very funny.
But I'm serious. We have them all the time. Come on, how about it?
I have to go now.
See you Saturday night.
I wouldn't count on it. I can't do it. Let's get me out of here.
You can do it, Softy. Come around. Round you go. Get old traffic. Come on.
That film, like other of Lupino's films, that film is really very much relies on location shooting. The Kabat Kaiser Institute was where she shot those scenes, and so I think it underscores Lupino's interest in that kind of realism, that sort of post-war realism that we talk about.
And she really used patience there, didn't she?
Yeah,
wow.
She did.
Yeah, I mean, she pretty much, she was really impressed by Roberto Rossellini. I mean, a lot of people in Hollywood and in America were impressed by neorealism, and she was doing the same sorts of things at the same time and wanted to continue in that vein. So, yeah, using real people, non-actors, location shooting, without so-called contrived mise-en-scène and a lot of post-production work. Those were some of her hallmarks.
Yeah.
And I think that film is also interesting. It's probably least associated with film noir of Lupino's films, and yet for me, the representation of the failed American dream, that's such a prominent theme in film noir, is really important in Never Fear. Like that whole sequence about the happy homes, and the film's deeply ironic treatment of, post-war domesticity, and the exploitation.
Well, and the hustlers, trying to exploit, the idea, Roosevelt's idea that, everybody should have housing, and a home a place to call home,
It's almost built, when you're thinking of something like Never Fear or Outrage, they're almost structured, they're structured very similarly, in that at the beginning you're told, that this is true, it's shot on the real locations, blah, 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 and the lead female character goes through a traumatic experience, she kind of loses her way, finds this figure that helps her regain her confidence, and then she ends up going home again by the end, like returning to her roots. And I think I read some earlier criticism of her work that said, as groundbreaking as she was, in her heart in some of these films, a lot of them are the ultimate message is very kind of conservative.
We don't agree with that at all. If you just take Outrage as an example, there's enough ambivalence and ambiguity there, and we have prior knowledge of what going home means, that we know that, things are never going to be the same. She's going home because the man she loves and wants to marry won't have her, And, she's going back to a guy who had absolutely no understanding of her situation, who even treated her violently, her parents are completely out of it. It's a terrible place to live. Everybody knows what happened to her. Going home is not going to be a happy ending, But I think her ultimate message is, just don't be fooled by this,
And you could say about the end of Not Wanted, that's not a particularly happy ending. Drew just kind of crumbles to the ground, as he's trying to chase Sally, and she comes back out of love and sympathy, but the camera sort of retreats, and you get this sort of long shot of the two of them crumpled up together on the ground. Okay, so maybe they'll be together, but it's such a muted ending, and so actually really goes against the sort of ameliorative cinema that Hollywood film touts. So, I don't think that, I think that's, a sort of superficial response, that just because, and think about also the ending of The Bigamist, which is quite ambiguous. We don't know what's going to happen, with these three.
It looks pretty horrible, actually.
The Hitch-Hiker is one of the classic film noirs, and perhaps Lupino's most popular work as a director. It's also the only one to feature an all-male cast. Released in 1953, the film is based on the real-life exploits of Billy Cook, a death row inmate at the time of the film's pre-production, who was convicted of murdering 6 people in a cross-country killing spree. The film opens as 2 unsuspecting male friends pick up the hitchhiker as they travel to Mexico on a fishing trip.
Face front. And keep driving. From now on, while you're driving, keep both hands high on that wheel. And you, keep one hand along the top of this seat. The other hand high on that window. All right. Now turn off the next side road we come to.
First of all, just there isn't a question in this. I just want to tell you guys, it contains one of my favorite shots in all of film noir, which is near the beginning, where the hitchhiker first enters the car and the camera kind of dollies in to the back seat, and he leans forward with the light illuminating his face, and that's such great noir.
Yeah.
But this is she was the first female to direct a studio noir, wasn't she?
Yeah, and also I should add that she had just had a baby too, so she's tramping around the Southwest, shooting in the desert, and
wow.
She was roundly criticized by the government because when she made The Hitchhiker, Billy Cook was on death row, and so there were rules about representing stories of people who were on death row, and so she had to negotiate that. Also, she was negotiating with the censors and the government. Also, went to San Quentin to visit Billy Cook to get a release signed and to give him money for his story, which I think is amazing. And it's visually, an incredible film, but also, the traits of film noir, the sense of futility, the questioning of, gender, masculinity, the sort of weird inversion with the characters, who are the so-called good guys, the sort of post-war trauma, that, this idea that Roy and Gil are themselves kind of prone to violence, which is symbolically seen in, the moment is Gil is having to, shoot the can from Hand, and all of that sort of post-war stress about gender, and the symbolism of the one eye always being open, which is also kind of stunning. This sense of never be able to escape trauma or violence. The ambiguity of whether or not Gillenroy can get away, because Myers may be away.
Yeah, because they're under constant surveillance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, her choice to not, to have so much Spanish in the film, and to have the Mexican characters speak in Spanish without translating, I think is really interesting in terms of the film's investment in realism.
These are men trying to escape the world of domesticity to which American men and women were supposed to return after World War II, and that's where they were supposed to find their bliss. But these are two men, like so many men in America at the time, white men, middle class, felt suffocated by that, and so they're making their escape, and they lie to their wives. They tell them they're going fishing, when in fact, they're wandering around, and maybe at first, they'll stop at a strip club they've been to as soldiers, stuff like that, and this is sort of the, ironically, their escape is just further entrapment, and the entrapment is in sort of the sociopath as being the apotheosis of American masculinity, this autonomous guy who made it on his own, stuff like that, all these ideals that become utterly perverse in the film.
Was she, because when you talk about Ida Lupino, you talk about a lot of firsts. I mean, the only woman directing studio pictures at that period of time when she was operating, the first woman to direct a film noir, on and on and on. Was she concerned with being first? I mean, was that a cognizant goal in her mind, or not?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. I mean, she was ambitious in the sense of wanting, to make art and make films and be creative, but not in that sense of competition. I agree. In fact, so many of her films are kind of about this sort of problem with competition. Think about Hard, Fast, and Beautiful. I think that film is really interesting because it sort of has two representations of ambition and competition. One is the Fletcher version, which is kind of awful and exploitative, about, the importance of winning. And the other is this young woman played by Sally Forrest, who is literally kind of, competing with her domestic experience by playing tennis against the garage door and trying to, imagine some better life for herself. So I think that's one of the interesting things to me about that film is that it has that sort of double view of ambition and competition, where that's determined by gender. For men it means one thing, and for women it means something very different. And I think was sensitive to that.
Her template, or the model she has offered us in film history is one of collaboration, because yes, she was one of the producers, yes, she was one of the writers, and once, she acted in her films, but in her directing, she collaborated with everyone. I think a good example of that is Outrage, where the production designer, Harry Horner, his hand is felt very heavily in the visual work that resembles German Expressionism, which is the world he came out of. And she wanted that, she wasn't trying to be number one. She wanted to collaborate.
She had a nickname on the set of Mother, and it was sort of printed on her director's chair. And that came from early on when she was mentoring these young actors like Sally Forrest and Keith Purcell. But, sometimes Lupino was criticized, for sort of falling into stereotypical female roles like mother, whereas I think that's a little bit wrong-headed, because that role of mother was really a sign of how familial and collaborative she was in thinking about film production. So it actually gets back to our earlier conversation about negotiating with the censors and, her conciliating when she needed to, and yet holding on to the points that she needed to make the film she was trying to make. But, she would say things, I think this came from some of her television directing, but she'd say things to her performers like, I know this is going to sound a little kooky, but mother, wonders if you could try it this way, or wonder if you could try it that way, lovey bird, or, so she had this kind of way
a drag persona, really.
Yes, right. So she had this way of asserting herself that was non-threatening and yet decisive. And so I think that the point about collaboration is really important. And kind of defines her feminist filmmaking.
Did she consider herself a feminist?
No, I don't.
But I think that's because, maybe in a different era, possibly, maybe she would have said yes, but you have to remember this is when people were trying to or feminist critics were talking with her in the 70s and so on, and she did not want to align herself with a movement that was, political, I think.
Yeah.
And she just to clarify, I think it was her second husband, Collier Young. When she really truly embarked in earnest on her directing career, she formed a production company with him, the filmmakers, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also with Melvin Wald, there are three of them, but Wald was the writer, and Lupino was producer and writer and director, and Collier Young was producer.
Yeah.
And that's how the labor was divided up.
What price should a woman pay for one night of indiscretion?
Are you sure you want me?
I'm sure.
That love on hurt.
The Bigamist. One careless moment, one false step, and 3 people were trapped.
How long has this double life of yours been going on?
Filmmakers, producers of Hollywood's most daring motion pictures, proudly presents Joan Fontaine, Ida Lupino, Edmund O'Brien, and Edmund Gwen in the shocking story of 2 women who gave all their love to one man. See The Bigamist.
To a point about how remarkably open Lupino was. Think about The Bigamist. So she was divorced from Collier Young, who was producing the film. And Collier Young's wife, Joan Fontaine, was one of the female leads in The Bigamist. So here she is directing Joan Fontaine in a film, and herself performing in The Bigamist, and collaborating with her ex-husband, Collier Young, in a movie about bigamy. It's just...
Yeah, well, he'd had an affair with Joan Fontaine, which was why their marriage broke up.
And
wow. I didn't realize that. That movie takes on a whole different context when you do that.
It sort of enacts this sort of deconstruction of marriage and social institutions, which is so much in keeping with Lupino's, mental landscape.
The last feature, which is The Trouble with Angels. Tell me what kind of subtext you see in that.
Well, I see a kind of there are many, but one is kind of an appropriation of. This is what I wrote about in the book of object relations theory, where Mary, played by Haley Mills, comes to the convent school with a real chip on her shoulder and a very difficult, dysfunctional family situation and no mother. And she gradually comes to identify Mother Superior, played by Rosalind Russell, as the good mother. And a child in this scenario needs to have bad mother and good mother be incorporated into one who can be both bad and good. That's sort of the end result. And there are many representations in the film that go along with this. When Mary's looking out the window at Mother Superior, she was really angrily, and we see Mother Superior just looking up at her with sort of an open and expectant expression, and how throughout the film she kind of assimilates these various images and ultimately sees Mother Superior as a flawed human being, but a really good human being as well, and can accept her flaws as not being making her bad. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect of the film. I think it's some of the praise for the film has come from critics who see it as kind of a more sort of through erotic glances and so on in those terms. And I see it more in terms of these mother-daughter looks.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add one thing? I think it's really interesting that on the one hand, people generally see The Trouble with Angels as so different from Lupino's earlier work, a coming of age, comic film with Haley Mills and Rosalind Russell. But I think as Therese is saying, it really is a film about female space and female bonds, and that links it with the earlier films, very much so.
Mm. That, sort of like what could have happened to these young women who are left in these desperate straits, were left hanging in the earlier films. Here's what a world for them, a haven for them would look like. And it takes place, deliberately enough, in a world pretty much devoid of men.
Which is an interesting mirror of The Hitch-Hiker, which is a world devoid of women.
Devoid of women, yeah.
Did she have ambitions to direct other features after that point, or did TV just kind of take over? Because she directed a lot of TV after that.
Yeah.
She directed many, many episodes. She did. She was always working on thinking about projects. It was the time when many Hollywood figures were moving over to television because that's where the opportunities were. And so that's where she went. And she joined with Dick Powell and David Niven on the what is the company called? The Four?
Right, the Four Star.
The Four Star. Yes.
Yeah.
And so she performed in those episodes, but then she went on to direct comedies like Donna Reed's Show and Bewitched, and I was completely reliving my childhood in working on this part of the book because it was all these great old episodes, and who knew, like you were saying about The Hitch-Hiker being the only film noir directed by a woman, who knew that these, great old television episodes were directed by Ida Lupino, and that they were cross-generic, that she directed westerns like Have Gun Will Travel and The Virginian, and she directed mysteries and thrillers like The Untouchables, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. She directed several.
And her terrific Twilight Zones.
Oh my God, The Mask.
Yeah.
Only woman. That's another first, right? Or the only. She was the only woman to direct The Twilight Zone, and that is an incredible episode. And then she directed, the comedies, thrillers, across genres, and for, I would say, about 12 years. I think something like 1956 to 1968. The story goes, I have heard through those who knew Lupino well, that she actually directed many more episodes than was credited for, because she would get calls at the last minute, from directors who are, hungover. Oh, can you come in and cover for me? And
that TV work, excuse me, it really challenged her to be as versatile as possible. I mean, when you think about all of these worlds that she's trying to inhabit and all these different genres. But there's another thought I have that, I romanticize, like a lot of film lovers, I romanticize the period of the New Hollywood filmmaking, the early 70s filmmaking. And I'm thinking, Ida Lupino was really a New Hollywood before there was a New Hollywood. The taboo subjects that movies felt unafraid of exploring in those films in the early 70s, she was right there 20 years earlier.
That's such a great point. Agree.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that she was constantly sort of working through similar themes, which is what constitutes her role as a feminist auteur. I mean, she was always interested in issues of exploitation and marginalization, and she had a kind of constant tone of irony, getting also the connection to the new the 70s filmmakers you alluded to. I mean, her mode was irony. She was interested in showing how reality diverged from hopes, dreams, and desires, and the sort of trauma that inflicts on people. And she was interested in storytelling that focused on men and women struggling to attain their desires despite the obstacles they face.
Yeah, remarkable. My last question for you guys, and you both can address this question. It's actually kind of a two-parter. Over the decades since her work first premiered in the 40s and 50s in these films that she directed, how do you see that we've reassessed these films? Do they speak to the subsequent decades in a different way? And the second part of that would be why do we need to see her films today? How do they speak to us today?
Wow. I'll take a shot at that. It's a very, very good question. Her work has been repeatedly rediscovered. I think that over time, there have been shifts. I mean, as feminist film historians have been, let me finish the point about rediscovery. I mean, the reason why we wrote the book is because we thought, well, okay, maybe she can stay rediscovered this time, right? Because she kept being rediscovered, and then other critics or viewers or readers would say, oh, but there's this problem, or, but she didn't do that. Instead of focusing on what she didn't do, we were interested in focusing on what she did do, which is, as we've been talking about this hour, really, really quite remarkable. That's a start. And Therese, I'm sure.
Yeah, she definitely is meaningful to different audiences today, and I'm not saying different from the audiences at the time, but I think people are more perhaps willing to speak publicly now about having been raped, for example, and what the traumatic aftermath is. And, so many people I've heard from, and this, I mean, of course, this is anecdotal, but say that, she captured that perfectly. And that is what she does show. I mean, the post-traumatic stress, and how that she also likens that to post-traumatic stress after returning from war in the Minister, who talks a bit about that. But she also makes the difference between men and women's reactions to trauma, in that women clearly aren't heard or understood.
Yeah, right.
And it's not as simple as going to a place of bucolic bliss, because to regain yourself, because a place of bucolic bliss can also be a place where a rapist lurks, So it's a different dynamic. And the other thing is The Trouble with Angels is a constantly popular film for girls, and is handed from. It's given from hand to hand, in DVD form. And girls I've spoken with have watched it. Their mothers have given it to them, and they pass it on to their friends. So it's still meaningful, because it is a story of empowerment for girls, and is also, it's increasingly less rare, but one of the rarer coming of age stories, which are about girls.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are my impressions. I think she is absolutely germane today, particularly in the ever emerging discussions of the American dream and so on. I mean, she shows us how the American dream is limited, and it still is. It's still, we haven't reached a point of parity or equality. We're still fighting for that. And anyway, the implications are great even today.
Yeah. And that, I agree with all of that. And also, I think that in terms of film history and social and cultural and media history, I mean, she was a forerunner to more contemporary filmmakers like Catherine Bigelow, who similarly crosses, conventional gender and genre roles, by making film noir and war movies, and so I think in terms of that aspect of her groundbreaking career, it's important for people to know about this history, and so it's this kind of both in terms of her content and her quite brave and courageous and intriguing searing critique of social institutions in her films, and also her role as a forerunner to contemporary women filmmakers, who are pursuing all kinds of stories and not wanting to be limited by gender conventions. I think she's a very important figure, and obviously her versatility and her how much she did. I mean, she just did so much for many decades, and so she's a pretty remarkable figor.
I just love her, and I'm so happy
I'm
that
glad to hear that.
Yeah, and I Kino Lorber released their Blu-ray set of her work, I think, last year, and all of her movies that she directed are available for streaming. I'm just so glad this work has been preserved, and that you guys have written about it. You guys have carried on her legacy by filling us in about these great films.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie.